If you're like in like Nazi Germany, and it is the case that there's like Jewish people in your attic and you're trying to protect them.
Example. Believe something, you stake your life on it.
What do you mean by that?
You live for it, and you die for it. That's what I mean by that.
Okay, so you're saying that you don't believe something if you wouldn't die for it?
Not really, no.
Okay, so then
How would you define belief?
I could believe it is the case that this pen exists, but if someone like threatened my life, right, I would lie in order to be able to save my life, right? You wouldn't lie to save your life?
How much do you know about me? I didn't lie to save my career. I didn't lie to save my clinical practice.
Would you lie to like save your children, your mom, your dad?
I don't think lying would save them.
Can there ever be a circumstance logically that lying could save someone's life?
Yeah, and if you're steeped in sin, you're likely to live in circumstances like that.
I'll give you an example. If you're like in like Nazi Germany, and it is the case that there's like Jewish people in your attic and you're trying to protect them, would you lie to like the Nazis?
I would have done everything I bloody well could, so I wouldn't be in that situation to begin with. If you present me with an intractable moral choice that's stripped of context and you back me into a corner, you're playing game. I would do everything that I could to make sure that I'm never in that situation.
I prioritize a lot of stuff.
I said that the closer you get to the pinnacle, or the closer
How close?
you get...
Can you give me some sort of metric? How close do I got to get to this pinnacle?
Do you know the difference between cheap literature and deep literature?
Yes.
Okay, that's the same issue. And how do you distinguish between them? What's the difference between cheap and deep?
I mean, it's really an opinion-based thing, right?
Is
I mean,
it? So it's just an opinion that Dostoevsky is better than a porno magazine?
Well, I've spoken to people who think To Kill a Mockingbird's cheap. It's one of my favorite books. So, I mean, people will differ on opinions.
Well, just because people are stupid about things doesn't mean that their opinion is valid.
That's certainly true. I agree with that.
Okay, well, do you think there is a hierarchy in literary quality?
I think that there is a hierarchy to an extent in literary quality, but I think once you get to a certain threshold, it is just opinion. Like, I agree. Dostoevsky is better than a porno mag, but is F. Scott Fitzgerald better than Ernest Hemingway? I don't know.
Yeah, fair enough. Why do you think that?
Because of what a book is, what literature is. Dostoevsky, he follows what literature is the purpose of more than the porno magazine does.
Good.
So your claim that morality and purpose can only be found in science is a little shaky, because I think that your claim is really being framed to be morality and purpose can only be found in religion. Is that how you're kind of framing it?
I would say that the domain of religion is the domain of morality and purpose. Yes, exactly. And also that science is actually structured, at least in part technically, to eliminate such considerations from its purview a priori. Right? That's why we define science as value-free. But that has to be wrong, because scientists have to prioritize their attention towards something before they can even engage in observation. And that act of prioritization of attention is a value-predicated act. And so I can continue. There's all sorts of things we have to assume about science before it can take place.
Okay, so what I'm specifically pointing out here is about religion in particular, since you yourself are a Christian, right?
People debate about that, and I generally don't discuss it publicly.
Okay, I understand that. And me, myself, I am a former young earth creationist fundamentalist.
Oh, yeah.
So I have experience in this. I used to run a TikTok channel directed about apologetics about the Bible, specifically in this type of facet with morality, evolution and such, and going back and forth with that.
And you use it to direct your attention.
Right.
So whatever you're attending to, you're worshiping.
Right. So I've kind of become a little bit familiar with your idea of like this value-laden hierarchy, right? And you kind of posit that at the bottom of this hierarchy, or you call it top or bottom, I suppose. Right. At the bottom of this hierarchy, this foundational priority in your life is going to be considered God.
That's
is that
right.
Correct?
Yes.
Right. I'm trying to imagine a situation in which could there be that someone has a priority at their foundation that is different from someone else's?
Oh, definitely.
Right. So we can have different conceptions of God.
That's why we fight.
Right. So essentially, there's not one God, but there are multiple gods, and these gods exist in some realm of truth. It's true that this person has one God and it exists.
Yeah, probably better to think about it as multiple values, but that there's a hierarchy of values with something at the bottom.
Right, but at the bottom is God, and
that's a definition. Yeah.
Yeah. So at the bottom is God, and there can be multiple people with different conceptions of God, and they're each valid in being called gods. Right.
Right. So then there's a harmony. That's why I talked about harmony earlier.
So you navigate your life, right, in accordance kind of to this principle of self-sacrifice. Can I say it in that way?
Yes, you can
Right.
definitely say it that
Thank
way. That's exactly right. And
Right.
navigate is the right term.
So someone does not have to have any awareness of Christ, of the story of Jesus, but let's say 60% of their actions, right, or more, whatever kind of metric you want to use, are in line with this self-sacrificial.
The Christian thinkers of the Middle Ages dealt exactly with that problem when they
Yeah.
were talking about the pre-Christian philosophers, for example. And they noted the similarity, let's say, between pre-Christian Greek thought and later Christian thought, and presumed that there were moral actors outside the Christian domain.
Right.
They're
So is that
addressing
person
the
Christian,
same-
though? Is that person Christian?
Well, to some degree, again, that's a matter of definition, because
Exactly.
they wouldn't be proclaiming Christian propositions, but they're acting out the pattern.
Of
Right? So,
Christianity.
yeah, so you imagine that full Christianity would involve a dozen things. And you can imagine someone who knows nothing of Christianity, say, acting out 8 of them.
Right.
Right.
If you give a chimpanzee 2 grapes, right, and his buddy gets 3, right, he actually freaks out, right? But you give both chimps 3 grapes and they're good. We have examples of parrots. I think
Except
it's
for the
parrots.
greedy chimps.
Except for the greedy chimps.
They want 4 grapes.
They want 4 grapes. You know, those do exist, right? But we have similar examples where we do animal tests, right? And
So morality is intrinsic.
I think
So it precedes science.
that actually
right?
a better way to define it would be that social animals, which we are, right,
Yeah.
require some level of morality or
Into what? I'm not disagreeing.
Sure.
Why do they require that?
because it's the only way that social groups can actually survive, right?
That's my point with
Sure.
regards to science. Thank you very much.
Is that
Precisely the point that you just made, that science has to exist within a moral framework that isn't in itself scientific.
how's that not scientific?
Well, because it's not derived from the scientific process, as you just
It
indicated
doesn't need
by
to derive
pointing
from the
to
scientific process. It's
hang
the
on,
fact that
hang on a sec.
we are social animals and we need that to exist as a group.
So I mean, something you worship is something that you have a reverential view for in a manner in which you believe it to be above and beyond normal things you like. Like you
So do you
presumably
have
worship
that
God.
attitude towards your wife?
I have that
Do you
attitude.
privilege her compared to other women?
Of course, I privilege her compared to
Okay.
other women, but I don't worship her. Nor
Well-
does she worship me.
By the definition you just offered, yes, you do. Because you just offered a definition that involved prioritization and elevation.
Well, and thinking that she is divine above and beyond what a normal natural
women-
phenomenon can be. Not other women, no, beyond any human being could ever be. I will prioritize her over
See,
any
you're
other
making
human, but I
the
don't
assumption.
think that she is some
You're making the
supernatural being.
assumption that only the thing at the top or the bottom has anything to do with worship. And I'm saying that's not true. It's a hierarchy of prioritization. And there's either something at the top or the bottom, depending on the metaphor, or you're fragmented and confused. Those are the only options.
So let's say
you're
I'm
either going in many directions
Okay.
or you're going in one
So
direction.
let's suppose I'm fragmented and confused. Then you
Yeah.
agree I don't worship anything.
No, then you'd worship multiple things.
So what's the threshold when it's worship, right?
That's why Nietzsche warned that when God died, as he announced in 1850, that people would be flooded with pointless, anxiety-ridden, hopeless nihilism. And that was what would attract them for example, to the false gods of totalitarianism, which is exactly what happened, because everybody worships something, even atheists who think they don't.
Aren't there unhappy Christians or
course
devoted
there are.
believers? So worshiping something is neither sufficient nor necessary for happiness then.
Well, terrible things can come your way regardless, and that does
Okay.
happen, but it's the case that even when circumstances become deeply troublesome, that how you're oriented makes a big difference. So I'll give you an example. So the book of Job deals with the issue of unfair suffering. So Job is a good man who has everything taken away from him in the most painful possible way.
To settle a bet, right?
With Satan,
Yes.
yes. And so he makes the axiomatic presumption that he won't lose faith in himself or in the spirit of being itself. And that helps him remain calm and forward-looking through his time of trial.
Doesn't he absolutely curse God? Oh,
No, his wife tells him to do that.
thank you. Thank you, sir.
Yeah, good. Hello, Gerard.
Nice to meet you, sir. So you've said that worship is when you prioritize and sacrifice for something, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
But there's a hierarchy in there.
Sure. So I prioritize and sacrifice for my wife more than I would prioritize and sacrifice for a random person on the street, right?
Probably, yeah.
Presumably. Do I worship
I don't know,
my
I've
wife?
seen some pretty bad marriages.
Assuming a good marriage, are you saying I worship my wife?
I'm trying to define worship.
Well, that's what I'm asking. So prioritize and sacrifice. I do
The
those
higher
things.
it is in the hierarchy, the more what you're doing is akin to worship. But even in your trivial acts of attention, you're prioritizing and partaking in worship, even if you don't know it.
So I am
And it's
prioritizing.
partly, well, with regard to your wife, say. So why do you value your wife? You do value your
Yes,
wife.
I love
okay.
her. So I
Right.
prioritize and I
Okay.
sacrifice for her.
Right. So that's within the confines of love, let's say.
Sure.
What else does it serve?
What else does what serve?
Your love in your marriage?
I mean, I'm married to my wife because I love her. That's
Yeah.
also why I prioritize and sacrifice for her. I certainly wouldn't think I worship her, and I don't think anyone else would make that.
I'm
Are you
trying to
making
make
that
a
claim?
definition.
Okay.
Yeah, that there's a hierarchy of attentional priority, and as you move up it or down it, depending on whether you think about it as a pinnacle or a foundation, you move more towards worship. So then they'd be 8/12 Christian or something like
8/12
that.
Christian.
Well,
but to be like a full Christian, how can someone say I am Christian? Like I am Christian, not 8/12, but Christian.
well,
don't
I
understand.
hesitate to do that personally because I think it's the kind of goal that you be very careful about proclaiming. The technical.
But belief is not necessarily, to be mostly Christian, belief is not necessary. 8/12s or, right?
Well, it depends on what you mean by belief. See, because I would say that acting out the pattern is the deepest form of belief. Now, you could add to that what you say. So, maybe in the optimal situation, how you act
how you say
and what you imagine and what you say, they're the same, right? But you can imagine a hypocrite who says all sorts of wonderful things and does nothing, and you could imagine another person who acts in a very positive manner but proclaims nothing.
So
right?
what I'm kind of seeing is like a descriptive, a really comprehensive but descriptive analysis of human action, human thought, and by which we can characterize people and put people in boxes. But I don't see
Why in boxes? So then they'd be 8/12 Christian or something like
8/12
that.
Christian.
Well,
but to be like a full Christian, how can someone say I am Christian? Like I am Christian, not 8/12s, but Christian.
well,
don't
I
understand.
hesitate to do that personally because I think it's the kind of goal that you be very careful about proclaiming. The technical.
But belief is not necessarily, to be mostly Christian, belief is not necessary. 8/12s or, right?
Well, it depends on what you mean by belief. See, because I would say that acting out the pattern is the deepest form of belief. Now, you could add to that what you say. So, maybe in the optimal situation, how you act
how you say
and what you imagine and what you say, they're the same, right? But you can imagine a hypocrite who says all sorts of wonderful things and does nothing, and you could imagine another person who acts in a very positive manner but proclaims nothing.
So
right?
what I'm kind of seeing is like a descriptive, a really comprehensive but descriptive analysis of human action, human thought, and by which we can characterize people and put people in boxes. But I don't see.
Why in boxes? Humans drove slavery too.
Yes, exactly.
So there's no argument there. If slavery and anti-slavery were both driven by humans, what does your claim that they were driven by humans have to do with it?
Evolving morality based on the culture that within the society that they live in.
Okay,
So
fine.
with
I think
women's
that did
suffrage as
happen.
well is a very similar topic in the Bible. There are denominations in Christianity, such as Pentecostal movement, which do bolster women to be pastors, right? Which I think that's a great thing to do. But most like to disregard
Where do you
women.
think the idea that human beings were sufficiently equal to all vote and not be slaves came from?
Humans.
Yeah, but so did the idea of slavery.
So did the
that's
idea of God.
Fine, but what's your
Yes.
point? Like, you're not making an argument. You're just saying all thoughts come from humans,
Yes.
regardless of the thoughts.
It's not driven by a higher power. It's driven on our experiences
Define
as
higher.
humans, which is what is best for all people.
Is it driven by conscience?
It could be. Which conscious is also something that has evolved over time, and I think that's
What's
something
the
that does evolve in morality and empathy.
Okay, I don't understand the point that you're making.
Independent of people, we can use that, or more so, I want to be more specific, something that can be good, right, regardless of any end goal. It's just good.
No, I think good is tied up with goal.
Goal, okay, I completely agree. So, in a sense, this is why.
That's why the religious goal in Christianity is the establishment of the kingdom of heaven on earth. It's goal dependent.
Okay, right.
So it's in reference to a goal.
So,
Or the goal would be the
but
imitation of Christ.
Someone's goal, right, can be something that doesn't encompass being in congruence with God or being with God.
No, the
that be
thing
true?
that they want to be incongruent.
Oh, right, okay.
Hang
It
on
is
a
God.
sec. That's right.
Sorry,
That's
I
right. That's
corrected
good. That's
myself.
great. The thing they want to be in congruence with is fundamentally equivalent to their God.
So what makes someone a Christian and what makes someone not a Christian? What makes like that's what I'm trying to figure out because
That's a good question.
yes.
Yeah, well,
you.
probably the deepest answer to that is willingness to shoulder your cross voluntarily and trudge uphill regardless of circumstances.
Okay, so someone can have a God because in your definition, your first preference, that is God, right? So someone can believe in God, right? And not be a Christian, right?
So you and I agree on a lot. I mean, when it comes to talking about how men should be masculine and things of that nature, you and I are 100% in agreement. We just don't agree on the justification that God is the only thing that provides morality.
It's not a justification, it's a definition.
What's the difference then between a definition and a justification? I mean, it's ultimately psychologically the same thing.
Well, we have to define what we're talking about before we can debate.
Okay, well,
right?
so here's my
I
position.
said that God, among other things.
I'm actually a non-theist. I'm not an atheist. I believe the human condition is one of uncertainty. And what that means is that I don't believe that you can conclude there is a God with certainty, and I don't believe that you can conclude that there is a God without in the same position. Now, with that, I don't care. I still wake up every day, and I have motivation to be a moral person.
Define moral.
Moral, what I ought to do.
Okay, and how do you
And
come
what
to that
I ought
conclusion?
to do, ultimately, it comes down to what not just benefits me, but what benefits the entire planet, what benefits the entire system. I think that your entire moral perspective comes from linear thinking. And when you look at the reality of the universe, it's actually more so holistic.
So in the Bible, it talks a lot about slavery, right?
Yes.
Yes. So in that, it teaches you how to take care of a slave. Rather than saying slavery is wrong, I think
Now,
it
it
should
says
say
that in the story of Moses.
It says slavery is incorrect. It says
Well,
it's immoral.
that's why Moses leads his people away from slavery.
But why does the Bible predicate and tell people exactly how to take care of a slave? Isn't
Well,
that immoral? Wouldn't you say that culturally we've evolved as a species, as he said earlier about empathy?
Yeah, I would say that the reason we evolved, so to speak, away from slavery was because the West was founded on Judeo-Christian morality and the presumption that every person was made in the image of God.
Wouldn't you
And
say
so
that
slavery itself became immoral, and that was established by Protestant Christians in the UK, who then convinced the UK government for 200 years to go to war on
And
slavery.
wouldn't you say that this is about the cultural evolution of humans in general, rather than just Christianity?
No, I think it's the
'Cause-
flowering of the ideas that were embedded in the biblical texts across long spans of time.
I feel like this is just humans editing based on the cultural evolution
What do you
of
mean
morality.
by just?
Just?
Yeah, just humans.
Well, humans.
Editing.
Well, based on culture and history, right? We get better.
Well, they
and-
did do it based on culture and history, but
Yes.
culture and history have their foundations too. So
Well, yeah, but we're talking about slavery.
So there are multiple gods that exist.
it depends on what you mean by valid. So far, so good, but it depends on what you mean by valid, because I would say that some foundational conceptions don't play out when they're implemented. So if you put the wrong thing at the foundation, you end up in hell, for example. That's what happens in totalitarian states.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you're
So
saying
they're not all equal. Like all foundational principles are not equal, even though they might be equally foundational. Right?
So what makes one kind of foundational tenet like better than another one?
That's an excellent question. Iterability. Imagine that you play a game with someone and you're a kid, and it's fun. So then you play again and again and again.
So
Well, then
repetition.
it's playability across multiple iterations. So then you have a friend, and a friend is better than having a game,
So-
right? So that's one. Breadth of application is another. So if it's just for me now, it's not as good as something that would be benefit to both of us across time.
Right. So we're explaining like characteristics that can be applied to like these types of like foundational values. But why is it that this iterability makes it better, and what does better mean?
Well, one hallmark of better is likely to be selected voluntarily. So
Right.
it's invitational.
Another descriptive kind of quality. So we're talking about characteristics that in some type of system with a goal, an output being like, we could maybe say happiness, right? Or some type of
Harmony.
harmony,
Yeah,
right?
that's better. Not
Based-
happiness precisely, because it's too short term.
Exactly. So as someone who is an atheist, right, I can explain that within a system, there are things that we can see as better or worse to meet this goal or meet this output. But what we're interested in, though, is what could make these things, regardless of any system, right?
Well, imagine that you set up a system and you implement it, and it produces the opposite results to which you intend. Oh yeah, that's not a good system.
Exactly.
Right, so the foundational principles are lacking because when you implement them, the game degenerates instead of moving towards the aim.
Right,
Okay,
so we're talking about
okay.
within a system. When we talk about something being moral, right, just absolutely moral, it means that without a system, right, this thing is simply moral with no reason. Like, stance independent, this thing is good. So I'm trying to figure out if such thing can exist. And if so, do you believe that these things are moral in of themselves, like self-evidently moral, or are they moral in accordance with the system?
I
Right?
agree, but
Sure.
you pointed to the morality of Neanderthals, to the morality of chimpanzees. They didn't derive that from science.
They don't need to. That's not how
That's
that works.
my point.
Science explains it. So
No, science doesn't explain morality.
it doesn't explain how social animals would need to be
Well, that's
altruistic.
a complicated question.
Is it? But we see it though.
Yeah, but explaining the evolution of morality and explaining morality itself aren't the same thing.
Okay, so you're asking why does this happen?
Yes, that's more accurate.
Because we're social animals and we
Yeah,
need
but there's
to be.
more to it than that.
Is there?
Sure. For example, so we're moral animals that have a sense of the future.
Sure.
Okay, that makes us unique, and that structures our morality.
No, actually, there are other animals that can predict the future, or not,
Not
predict
really.
the future. No, tigers. Actually, there was a tiger at the SF Zoo that killed somebody, and so
Hunting
actually,
animals.
No. Kids threw shit at the tiger. The tiger actually plotted its escape, and it found the
I'm not
kids.
saying that animals can't think.
Okay.
No, but
let's
they can
pause here.
perceive the future. That's what I'm saying.
I
right?
agree, but
Sure.
you pointed to the morality of Neanderthals, to the morality of chimpanzees. They didn't derive that from science.
They don't need to. That's not how
That's
that
my
works.
point.
Science explains it. So
No, science doesn't explain morality.
it doesn't explain how social animals would need to be.
Well, that's
altruistic.
a complicated question.
Is it? But we see it though.
Yeah, but explaining the evolution of morality and explaining morality itself aren't the same thing.
Okay, so you're asking why does this happen?
Yes, that's more accurate.
Because we're social animals and we
Yeah,
need
but there's
to be.
more to it than that.
Is there?
Sure. For example, so we're moral animals that have a sense of the future.
Sure.
Okay, that makes us unique, and that structures our morality.
No, actually, there are other animals that can predict the future, or not,
Not
predict
really.
the future. No, tigers. Actually, there was a tiger at the SF Zoo that killed somebody, and so
Hunting
actually,
animals.
No. Kids threw shit at the tiger. The tiger actually plotted its escape, and it found the
I'm not
kids.
saying that animals can't think.
Okay.
No, but
let's
they can
pause here.
perceive the future. That's what I'm saying.
I can't define them any more accurately than I already did, really.
Okay. In regards to morality, when we talk about the divine, when we talk about God and religion, these moral tenets and religion, right, and God exists as good because it is God, right? So it's self-evident, right? Without any kind of goal or output, this thing is good. So I want to figure out how.
There's an element of that that's true. So, for example, in the story of Job, Job is unfairly tortured in consequence of a bet between God and Satan. And so Job is emblematic of someone who's being hurt for no apparent reason. Okay, so Job's response to that is that he refuses to lose faith in himself, and he refuses to lose faith in the ultimate goodness of being. Okay, and those are axiomatic decisions. They're not exactly evidence dependent because he is suffering. There's an arbitrariness in that that's reminiscent of what you claim.
So I'm essentially trying to figure out, do you believe that something can be good, like stance independently, something that can be good?
I don't know what you mean by stance independent.
Okay, so
you
I
mean
mean-
independent of people?
Okay. Do Catholics attend to Mary?
Well, yes.
Okay. So do they fit that description of worship?
Yes.
So you would say Catholics and other people that revere Mary, like the Eastern Orthodox tradition, worship Mary.
Well, they might not put her in the highest
But you would
place.
put it that way.
No.
You just said it. Now you're taking it back
There's
now?
still a hierarchy.
Okay, there's a hierarchy, but within the
There's something at the top.
All right, you can worship things
Mary
below.
is quite a ways up the hierarchy, but not at the top.
Let's go over your definition of worship again. What's your definition of worship?
Attend to,
Attend to.
prioritize,
Do
and
Catholics
sacrifice for.
do Catholics attend to? Do they prioritize Mary over all other human beings?
No, I didn't say overall, did I? I didn't add that to my definition.
You understand.
I said there was a hierarchy as well.
You attend a
So you can attend to something trivially, or you can attend to it deeply.
Okay, now you're adding stuff to the definition. But your original
I
definition.
added the hierarchy part at the beginning.
Are you
just
familiar?
didn't understand it.
So when you look at how Aristotle defined God, when he said that there had to be an unmoved moved or an uncaused cause, he was defining God from a linear perspective. And you do the same with morality, and you do the same with purpose.
How does my
I
definition
reject
of
that.
morality? How does my definition of morality hypothetically
Because,
differ from
because,
yours?
because you're saying that there's something that exists in a vacuum, that it exists in and of itself. And nothing in the universe exists in a vacuum. Nothing exists in and of itself. It's a whole systems-based morality. It's a systems-based reality.
Is there a
and
hierarchical
that is
structure?
what the quantum...
Is there a hierarchical structure? Are some things more important than others?
Are some things, I think some things lead to more benefits than
Then,
others.
by your own definition, some things are more important than others.
Yes.
Okay.
Okay,
What
let's
is
pause there. You've been voted out by the majority.
How you doing?
Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you.
I guess since you said morality and purpose cannot be found in science, it would just depend on like what you're referencing. If you're saying a description of your psychological preferences would be considered within science, sure. But I don't think that you have to say that it comes from science in order to be like an atheist.
Look,
They're
if you're
incoherent.
incoherent and fragmented and aimless, which is what happens if your objects of worship are unstructured and chaotic, then you're going to be anxiety-ridden and without hope. That happens. That's a technical argument.
But there's happy nihilists.
Oh, there
How
are.
do you
they?
explain that there are happy nihilists then? Because
Well,
you just said they
the
can't
mere
be.
fact that you state that there are happy nihilists doesn't make it true. Like, what's your evidence that, how do you measure nihilism and how have you associated it with happiness? And what's your definition of happiness? And have you compared them to religious people? Because if you do, by the way, it's clearly the case that religious people over the long run have better mental health. It's a well-documented fact in psychological literature.
Sure.
So your claim is just a claim. It doesn't stand on anything.
So you disagree with the claim that there exists even one happy nihilist?
I didn't say that.
Okay, would you agree there exists at least one happy nihilist in the universe?
It's not a question that has any meaning as far as I'm concerned, because it
Okay.
depends on what you mean by happy, and it depends on the duration that you're trying to calculate over. Now and then there's probably some deluded soul who thinks he's a nihilist who's momentarily pleased with himself. But as a long-term strategy to deal with the future, to get along with yourself and with others, it's sadly lacking.
Like, when I say in boxes, I mean like I can categorize you based on your actions, not based on necessarily what you say, but based on your actions that you are more so or less so Christian, right? Things like that, right? So we can categorize people as Christian.
Well, I would say more or less voluntarily self-sacrificing.
But that's also what we came to, though, is that someone can be like 60% or 70% Christian based on simply just acting in that
Yeah,
way.
Richard Dawkins is like that.
I watched that debate.
Let's pause there. You've been voted out by the majority.
Very good.
Thank you so much.
Really, very thoughtful.
Hey, Dr. Peterson.
How you doing?
Danny, nice to meet you.
What's your name?
Danny.
Danny.
You're saying atheists worship things or people or places, whatever. Can you be very clear about your definition of worship again?
Attend to, prioritize, and sacrifice for.
Okay, that's it. That's your understanding of worship.
Well, I could flesh it out, but that'll do for the time we have.
My point is that God influenced slavery. People looked at the Bible and went, this is moral because God says so, just like women's suffrage.
There's lots
and
of
just like homosexuality.
All human societies were slave owning, so you
Yes.
can't blame that on the Bible.
If humanity decided...
Oh, wait, address that first.
What, about
All
slavery?
human societies were slavers, so you can't blame that on the Bible.
Well, you can say it bolstered it.
Well, not if you look at the broad sweep of history, because it was the Protestant Christians
Based
in
on
the
their
UK.
interpretation of the Bible,
It was the Protestant Christians.
which evolves over time.
Let's pause there. You've been voted out by the majority.
All right. Well, it was great talking
Yeah,
with you,
nice
sir.
talking to you, too.
Yes.
Dr. Peterson?
Good to see you, man.
Pleasure.
What's your name?
Brian. So the first thing I would like to say is I would like to engage in this discussion in a symbiotic manner. I would not like to engage where there is one clear winner and one clear loser. Emotions are activated and it ultimately comes about ego. So I'm just saying I'm really trying to understand your position, and I would just like you to really try to understand my position.
There's many things, but one of the most fundamental is that you believe that the cosmos itself is founded on the principle of voluntary self-sacrifice. Best founded. Let me offer you a contrary example. So I could assume that power rules. And so that my assumption would be, if I can make you do it, I win. Right, and I can found a whole society on that, and that happens a lot, by the way. And that's also how societies tend to degenerate. And so that would be a society that was founded on the principle that you get to sacrifice and I don't have to. Right, now the contrary to that would be something like you give up voluntarily and with courage all the things you need to situate yourself properly in relationship to the future and other people. Right. So then there's a harmony. Well,
so it's about purpose and definitions.
Yeah, sure. Let me give you an analog then.
Okay.
The depth of worship is analogous to depth of literary significance. And the closer you get to what's deep, the more religious and worshipful your practice.
So
and maybe you don't know what's at the bottom, but something needs to be, or you're confused.
Well, so to use your analogy then, how deep do I have to go for it to be worship? Do I have to be Catcher in the Rye? Do I have to be War and Peace? Or
it depends on what you're seeking for.
I'm seeking to know whether I worship something. You've claimed I worship something, and I want to know.
If you want to have a deep and meaningful life, then you have to go all the way to the bottom or the top, and insofar as you're capable of doing that, because otherwise you'll be fragmented and miserable and anxiety-ridden and hopeless.
So I have to worship something to have a meaningful life. And
There's no difference between those two things.
Okay.
They're the same thing.
So if I don't worship anything, my life will not be meaningful, correct?
Well, that's the definition of nihilism.
Okay. So if I'm a nihilist, I don't worship anything.
That's true. And then
okay. Mm-hmm. You just said everybody worships something. I think you've just agreed there is a class of people that doesn't.
Well, they're incoherent in their worship, and hand gestures like that aren't going to help.
All right.
Yeah.
Well, okay.
As an agnostic atheist, I don't know if God exists, and I don't believe that a God exists. And the only ones that I would really reject would be like the all-knowing, all-powerful, all-good, perfect notion of God that plenty of Christians like prescribe themselves. So I guess
how is that relevant to this claim?
You're basing a position of morality and purpose in some like notion of God that isn't the same type of notion of God that typical Christians would prescribe. Your notion of God is
what typical Christians?
Yeah, typically when I talk to Christians, they say that they believe in an all-knowing.
How about Cardinal Newman, who defined God as conscience? He's a major influence on all of Catholic social theory. How about that Christian?
Sure. So do you believe in the all-knowing, all-powerful, all-good notion of God?
What do you mean by believe?
Do you think it to be true?
That's the circular definition. What do you mean when you say you believe?
How is that circular?
Because you added no content to the answer by substituting the word true and believe.
I said you think it to be true.
With that, if you're saying that morality and purpose cannot come from science, is the opposite of that true, that morality and purpose can only come from God?
That's a way of defining it, yes.
Okay.
That's right, that's good. So I would say that with regard to the first claim, say, atheists don't understand what they're rejecting, because I would say, by definition, God is the unity upon which moral claims are based. That's a definition, right?
Okay, if there is a God, what is the purpose of life?
Well, in the Christian tradition, the purpose of life is to engage in voluntary, upward, self-sacrifice so that the kingdom of heaven can be established on earth.
So you're trying to make it to heaven and avoid hell?
Yes, that's a good way of thinking about it.
Okay, and so should we not try to achieve infinite suffering on planet Earth? And if we can achieve infinite suffering on planet Earth without God, avoiding it, if we can do that without God, then does that defeat your claim?
Well, yeah, except that it doesn't, you circumvented my initial definition, because I said that by definition, God was the unified source of morality.